Trump imposes 50% tariffs on copper imports, citing national security concerns. Reuters, August 1st, 2025. Canada halts copper exports to U.S. in retaliation. $4.2 billion trade evaporates overnight. Financial Times, August 2nd, 2025. In less than 24 hours, the world's most integrated copper corridor collapsed. Prices in New York soared 13%, while London's fell. American factories scrambled, Canadian miners pivoted, politicians fumed. This wasn't just a trade spat, it was a seismic rupture in North American supply chains, triggered by one move and answered by another. If copper is the artery of modern industry, what happens when the heart of North America stops pumping? For decades, the copper trade between the United States and Canada was a quiet engine behind North America's economic engine. Canada, blessed with vast mineral reserves, exported billions of dollars in refined and semi-refined copper to its southern neighbor. The U.S., in turn, relied on these imports to fuel everything from electric vehicles to military-grade electronics. At its peak in 2023, Canada accounted for nearly 17% of the United States' total refined copper imports, a vital link in a continent-wide chain. This relationship wasn't merely transactional, it was embedded in free trade frameworks built on mutual trust and strengthened through integration in automotive, construction, and green energy supply chains. American manufacturers designed systems assuming Canadian copper. Canadian miners expanded operations assuming U.S. demand, but signs of strain emerged. As early as 2022, tensions rose over softwood lumber disputes and dairy quotas. Then came electric vehicle tax credits that heavily favored American-made content, sparking outcry from Ottawa. Behind the scenes, both governments grew increasingly wary. Washington feared dependency, while Canada feared protectionism. By mid-2024, copper started gaining strategic attention. U.S. defense contractors flagged vulnerabilities in copper sourcing. Economists warned that green energy goals, from solar panels to EVs, hinged on stable copper supplies. Yet no major disruption occurred until the summer of 2025. That's when President Trump, returning to his economic nationalism playbook, declared copper a strategic asset under threat, invoking Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. The message was clear: safeguard U.S. industry, even at the cost of a key ally. For Canada, the message was even clearer. Exports were no longer guaranteed, and loyalty was not reciprocated. The golden era of seamless cross-border copper had ended, replaced by suspicion, tariffs, and retaliation. On August 1st, 2025, President Donald Trump, in a live-streamed cabinet meeting, announced one of his administration's boldest trade maneuvers, a sweeping 50% tariff on semi-finished copper products imported into the United States. The decision, made under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, classified copper as a strategic metal essential to national security. The scope was vast: copper wires, rods, tubes, and cables, the arteries of modern industry, now taxed at historic levels. Steel, aluminum, lumber, cars, we've done it all. Now we're doing copper, Trump declared, flanked by aides nodding in approval. The announcement sent immediate ripples through markets. On the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, CME, copper futures soared 13% within hours, peaking at $5.69 per pound, an all-time record. Meanwhile, the London Metal Exchange, LME, saw prices drop by 2%, highlighting the beginning of a pricing divergence between U.S. and international copper markets. Behind closed doors, administration officials justified the move with national security language. A confidential White House memo cited potential threats to the U.S. military's dependence on foreign-sourced copper, a narrative echoing earlier steel and aluminum tariffs. But critics were quick to point out the contradiction. The tariff applied only to semi-finished products, while raw copper cathodes, the purest form, were exempt. And where did the majority of those cathodes come from? Canada, Chile, Mexico, and Peru, all U.S. allies. More troubling for economists was the timing. Demand for copper was already spiking globally due to the electric vehicle boom and global decarbonization efforts. EVs require up to 80 kilograms of copper per vehicle, about 4 times more than internal combustion cars. The new tariffs threaten to supercharge inflationary pressures at a precarious economic moment. For American manufacturers, especially those in the EV and renewable sectors, the policy felt like a gut punch. Tesla and Ford reportedly lost millions in copper-related costs within days. Meanwhile, U.S.-based component suppliers in Indiana and Ohio, who rely on Canadian copper for wire harnesses and power modules, scrambled to renegotiate contracts or find new suppliers, often at much higher costs. The administration defended its decision as a long overdue correction of unfair trade practices. But in reality, Canada had never been accused of dumping copper or manipulating markets. There was no trade imbalance. The move was symbolic, another chapter in Trump's doctrine of economic self-sufficiency, even if it risked collateral damage. Yet the consequences weren't merely economic. In framing Canada as a potential risk to U.S. national security, even implicitly, the administration fractured one of the continent's most stable trade relationships. Diplomats in Ottawa described the move as deeply provocative, and even Republican lawmakers in copper-dependent states expressed unease. This wasn't just a tariff, it was a shot fired across a familiar border, one that wasn't ready for war. The Canadian response was fast, strategic, and quietly devastating. Within 24 hours of Trump's tariff announcement, Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Melanie Joly, held a press briefing in Ottawa. Calm but resolute, she confirmed what analysts feared. Canada would immediately suspend all exports of copper-based products to the United States. No transition period, no back-channel diplomacy, just a cold, surgical halt, effective midnight. The shock was total. Canada had exported approximately $4 billion in copper products to the U.S. in 2024, accounting for 17% of total American copper imports. According to CGEP and Financial Times estimates, this sudden freeze wiped out $4.2 billion in trade value in one stroke. For a trade relationship that had weathered disputes over milk and lumber, this was unprecedented. Canada's logic was simple. If the U.S. would weaponize trade tools and treat an ally as a strategic threat, Canada would respond with economic sovereignty. In Joly's words, Canada will not enable a policy that punishes cooperation and rewards chaos. But retaliation wasn't the only strategy. Almost immediately, Canadian copper producers, including Hudbay, Teck Resources, and Glencore's Canadian operations, began pivoting to Asian markets. Japan, South Korea, and China expressed immediate interest. Within a week, Ottawa unveiled a $1.8 billion Canadian dollar investment package to expand copper export infrastructure to Asia and diversify away from U.S. reliance. The speed of this pivot stunned Washington. American trade officials, caught flat-footed, scrambled to downplay the long-term impact. But industry insiders saw the writing on the wall. The North American copper corridor was broken. Canadian firms began rerouting supply chains. Ports in British Columbia prioritized East Asian shipping routes. Processing plants in Quebec began adjusting product grades to meet South Korean and Chinese standards. Analysts at CGEP labeled the shift as the fastest strategic export realignment in Canadian trade history. Beyond economics, the move carried political weight. Canada's message was clear. It would no longer tolerate being dragged into unpredictable U.S. trade wars. The rhetoric shifted from damage control to deterrence. "We're not interested in fighting," Joly told CTV News, "but we're even less interested in submission." Critically, Canada also hinted at legal retaliation. Officials indicated they would challenge the copper tariffs at the World Trade Organization if the U.S. did not roll back the measures by September. The last time Canada took the U.S. to the WTO over softwood lumber, it won. If history repeated, the copper case could become another landmark defeat for American protectionism. What made Canada's response different this time was the absence of outrage. No shouting, no bluster, just action and results. In a single week, Canada showed it could decouple, reorient, and retaliate without needing to escalate. The message to Washington was chilling in its simplicity. Don't mistake politeness for weakness. By the second week of August, the copper crisis had settled into a cold stalemate. The U.S. stood firm, with Trump refusing to reconsider the tariffs. "They'll come back when they realize how much they need us," he tweeted. Yet markets told a different story. The pricing gap between the CME and LME grew to 25%, encouraging traders to exploit arbitrage opportunities, buying cheap abroad, reselling high domestically. Supply remained tight, prices stayed volatile, and manufacturers continued to bleed costs. Canada, meanwhile, had shifted gears. Export deals with South Korea and Japan were signed within days. New mining permits were fast-tracked. The government launched a Buy Canadian Minerals campaign to promote domestic consumption and international diversification. Both sides had drawn their lines, and neither seemed willing to blink. This deadlock exposed the deeper truth. This was never just about copper. It was about control, about who gets to set the rules in a post-globalization world, about whether national security can be invoked for economic leverage, and about how quickly even the closest allies can turn into competitors when politics overshadows pragmatism. For the moment, no one wins. Canada loses a stable market. The U.S. loses a critical supplier. The world watches as a trusted trade corridor crumbles into strategic silence. For the mining town of Flin Flon, Manitoba, the Copper War wasn't an abstract geopolitical drama. It was an existential crisis. Home to one of Hudbay Minerals' largest operations, Flin Flon relied on copper exports to the U.S. for nearly 70% of its economic activity. Just days after Canada's retaliatory halt on copper shipments, trucks lined up at Hudbay's warehouse gates had nowhere to go. Contracts with U.S.-based buyers were frozen, and layoffs loomed. "We were preparing for expansion," said one Hudbay logistics manager in a CBC interview. "Now we're scrambling to repackage shipments for Korea and Japan, markets with different standards, different regulations." In the short term, communities like Flin Flon faced uncertainty. Temporary layoffs affected over 350 workers. Processing plants operated at reduced capacity. Municipal governments braced for a dip in tax revenue. Across the border in British Columbia, Teck Resources faced similar disruptions as it pivoted its copper concentrate shipments from the U.S. West Coast to Asian ports. But Canada wasn't sitting still. The federal government rolled out a 1.8 billion Canadian dollar investment plan focused on upgrading port capacity in Prince Rupert and Vancouver, fast-tracking rail improvements, and offering logistical subsidies to exporters. The move aimed to not just patch the damage, but to build resilience. Minister Melanie Joly summed it up. "We'll feel the short-term shock, yes, but this is an opportunity to accelerate our independence and secure long-term access to the world's most dynamic economies." Canadian exporters, for their part, adapted with surprising speed. New contracts were signed with South Korea's LS Cable and System and Japan's Sumitomo Corporation within a week. China's MMG also entered talks with Teck and Hudbay for multi-year supply agreements. Still, this strategic pivot came with growing pains. Canada was forced to reconfigure logistics, comply with new regulatory frameworks, and adjust product specifications. Some industry experts predicted a 10 to 15% loss in copper export value in the short term due to market unfamiliarity and lower pricing leverage in Asia. But one thing was clear: Canada wasn't going back. In the heartland of Ohio, an electric motor factory owned by Northvolt USA began halting its production line, not for lack of demand, but for lack of copper. The company, a key supplier of motor components for US-made EVs, had relied heavily on Canadian semi-finished copper products. But the new tariffs, combined with Canada's export freeze, meant prices had surged and supply timelines had collapsed. "We're paying 30% more for copper wire, and delivery times have doubled," a Northvolt procurement officer told Reuters. "We've lost 2 major clients in the past week." They weren't alone. In Indiana, a mid-sized wiring manufacturer lost a $12 million contract to a Vietnamese competitor who could deliver faster and cheaper. In Detroit, Ford reported a $94 million quarterly cost increase linked to copper inputs. Tesla filed a complaint with the Department of Commerce, noting that their cost per vehicle had increased by $90 due to copper price hikes alone. Utility companies also faced the squeeze. Pacific Gas and Electric submitted an emergency request to California regulators to raise electricity rates, citing a 22 to 25% increase in copper-based transmission costs. Analysts at UBS warned that rising input costs could shave 0.5 percentage points off U.S. GDP in Q3 2025, directly due to supply chain dislocations. The tariff policy, originally pitched as a move to strengthen national security, was backfiring in critical sectors. Renewable energy developers postponed solar farm projects in Texas and Nevada. Military contractors flagged delivery delays for radar systems and submarine power units. The inflationary ripple was felt across industries, from housing to consumer electronics. Meanwhile, copper traders exploited the arbitrage gap. With LME prices 25% below CME levels, they began buying foreign copper, stockpiling it in warehouses near U.S. ports, and lobbying for exemptions. The market, meant to be controlled, had become a chaotic patchwork of loopholes and inflated costs. One executive at a California manufacturing group described the irony bluntly. This tariff was supposed to insulate us. Instead, it's isolated us. The copper supply chain had once been invisible. Now, it was painfully visible and increasingly broken. North America now finds itself in a fragile balance, a once seamless copper corridor now severed by politics, price wars, and pride. Both Canada and the United States have taken bold, unilateral steps. Each has claimed justification. Neither has claimed victory. For Canada, the pivot eastward offers independence, but at the cost of historic trust. For the U.S., the tariff asserts sovereignty, but has exposed vulnerabilities in domestic industry and consumer cost. With global copper demand accelerating and geopolitical tensions rising, this is more than a bilateral dispute. It's a warning shot for a world redrawing its resource map. Will the U.S. double down on protectionism or reassess the true cost of economic nationalism? Will Canada pursue deeper global alignment or find new ways to re-engage with its closest neighbor? And most importantly, can two allies afford to become rivals in the age of scarcity? Like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive economic analysis.